Everybody. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Robert Joseph Taylor, and this term, the Program for Research on Black Americans and the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research are pleased to host the Group Dynamics Seminar Series. This is one of the longest running seminar series in the social sciences. Before I start, I'd like to mention a few things. So number one, the next speaker is David Williams from Harvard. However, his talk is on Tuesday, and it starts at 2:30, and you have to pre-register for that talk, just due to space considerations. In 2 weeks, our speaker is Christy Irving from Vanderbilt, and she's speaking on Black women's mental and physical health. And today's speaker, as you see here, is Taylor Hargrove. Taylor, like Christy Irving from Vanderbilt, are both relatively recent PhDs. Taylor received her PhD in sociology from Vanderbilt in 2016, and she started her current position as an assistant professor in sociology at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, this past fall. Dr. Hargrove's research seeks to uncover and explain the development of health disparities across the life course, focusing on the impact of race, skin color, gender, neighborhood, and social class. Her work bridges sociological, demographic, and gerontological perspectives to examine the joint consequences of these multiple systems of stratification on health inequality throughout the life course. Again, let's please welcome Dr. Taylor Hargrove.
Just want to turn the mic on. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for that lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to present to you one of the newer projects that I've been working on since my graduate studies. And it's really a project that brings together my ongoing interests and kind of the areas that I really want to expand into by basically examining the intersections of race and place, right? And so just a brief outline of what I'm hoping to get through today. I want to start off with a little bit of motivation, both kind of more broadly speaking, so the kinds of motivations that frame my broader program of research, and then of course get more specific in terms of the motivation for this particular project. And then discuss some of the gaps and issues that this project hopes to address. Excuse me, get into some of the results, talk about the implications of these findings and the limitations of this study, and then hopefully I'll leave you all with some concluding thoughts and directions for future research. So the purpose of this particular study is twofold. The first is to investigate how several dimensions of race differentially shape health and the nature of health inequality between white and African American young adults, so across early life. And then to explore the extent to which these relationships among dimensions of race and health vary depending on the broader social context in which these individuals grow up. So just to provide a broader context, right, for the significance of this study in general. So there's this overarching problem that exists, right, as I'm sure many of you in this room know, which is the unequal distribution of health and well-being among African Americans and whites. But what is particularly unsettling is that young African Americans, so late teens, early 20s, are already experiencing several diseases that traditionally manifest later in life for other groups. So one example is high blood pressure, right? So if we're looking at the percentage of Americans with high blood pressure, we can see that at every age group, African Americans have a higher prevalence rate, right? So ultimately, between the ages of 35 and 64, African Americans are almost 50% more likely to have high blood pressure. We see the same pattern for diabetes, with racial inequalities starting pretty early on in life and growing with age. And the same for stroke, right? Even at relatively younger ages of 18 to 34. And so somewhat unsurprisingly, all of this culminates into higher all-cause mortality rates among African Americans. Again, even at relatively younger ages. There's actually a slight mortality advantage for African Americans at much older ages. We can talk about why that might be in the Q&A. But throughout most of their life course, African Americans tend to live in poorer health. So that's a huge problem, right? When we're talking about mental health, the extent and the patterns of inequalities become a bit less clear, especially given research showing that there's this race paradox in mental health. And we can also talk about whether that's actually a paradox or not. But what this generally refers to is the fact that some studies find that despite greater exposure and prolonged exposure to adversity, African Americans still tend to have lower or comparable or better or more favorable mental health outcomes compared to whites. And so the strongest evidence for this comes from studies examining psychiatric disorders. So most studies find that African Americans have lower prevalence rates of different DSM-defined disorders. There's also some evidence, but not as strong, that comes from research looking at racial disparities in symptomatology, right, in which African Americans are shown to report fewer symptoms of generalized distress, right, so depression, anxiety, psychological well-being. But there's actually still quite a few studies and accumulating evidence that have documented higher levels of depressive symptoms or symptoms of psychological distress among African Americans. So the research is a bit more murky. So taking all this together, black-white differences in physical health have been well established in the literature, but the evidence of the direction and the extent of racial disparities in mental health is less consistent, right? So the jury is still kind of out on an answer to whether African Americans or whites have better mental health. The other important aspect of the literature on racial inequalities in health for this particular project is the ability of various frameworks to explain the patterns we see, right, or the lack of their ability to do so. So we know a lot about the underpinnings, right, at least theoretically, what might be causing some of these gaps. But when we take some of these factors into account, oftentimes there is what's called a residual gap, right, the disparity that's left over when we take into account different types of factors. And so what are some of these explanations, right? So patterns of health disparities and inequalities more generally have been attributed to what's called the fundamental causes of disease theory, which is basically this broad framework that says that social systems, social factors embody access to important resources that can be used to avoid or allay health risks, right? And so traditionally, research drawing on this theory has focused on socioeconomic position as kind of the fundamental cause of health. Right, and so of course there's been a lot of research showing that group differences in socioeconomic resources do indeed explain a substantial portion of racial disparities in health. Scholarship has also shown that exposure to stress and responses to social stressors in the form of coping resources play a role in explaining racial inequalities. As well as the availability and use of certain health behaviors, right? So some of these health behaviors like alcohol use, smoking, overeating, not so great for your physical health, but have been shown to help mitigate the negative effects of stress on one's mental health. But again, when we kind of put all these findings together and take into account socioeconomic, psychosocial, and behavioral factors, we still have this residual gap. We can't explain the whole gap. And so this has led researchers to consider what's called the added burdens of race, right, which really cites racism as this critical yet often overlooked contribution to health inequality. And I put newer in quotations because, this certainly isn't new. Right, over a century ago, W.E.B. Du Bois, in one of his seminal pieces, Philadelphia Negro, cited racism as this factor influencing life chances among African Americans. But it's really only more recently that scholars have, explicitly considered and conceptualized and highlighted racism as a fundamental cause. Right? So there is research showing that institutional racism, such as race-based segregation, and interpersonal racism, so experiences of discrimination, shape health both directly and indirectly via access to socioeconomic resources or opportunities, right? Exposure to stressors, in some cases accelerated physiological aging. And then, of course, residents in neighborhoods that are characterized by concentrated social and economic disadvantages. But again, empirically, it's really hard to capture racism, right? Especially if you're a quantitative researcher working with data sets that have already collected this kind of information. And so we still struggle with the same problem of trying to really understand and meaningfully address these residual gaps that we see, meaningfully in an empirical kind of framework. And so this is where the motivation for this particular study really lies, right? So I'm interested in trying to better understand or unpack these residual gaps that we see. And so in particular, I'm going to offer 3 things that we can do, and I'll go over each of these things in more detail in just a few seconds. But I argue that, one, we should be looking earlier in life, looking at inequalities earlier in life to see what might precede some of these big gaps. I argue that we should revisit what is meant by race and how we measure race in these social surveys and social data sets. And then third, we really need to incorporate more explicitly the social context in which individuals are navigating, right, or growing up in. Okay, so in terms of the first option, right, so early life is an extremely important period for understanding social inequality throughout your life course, right? So we know that health profiles during adolescence and the transition to adulthood or young adulthood are related to later life outcomes, either by directly affecting our health down the road, so thinking about the long arm of childhood kind of framework, and by placing us on different trajectories of socioeconomic disadvantage, achievement, right, health behavior, social development, things of that nature. So our health in early life really does structure kind of our experience, the aging experience, and our life opportunities. And so what does health actually look like in early life, right? So there's this common thought or notion that young adults are healthy, right? Best period of your life. It's actually not true. So according to calculations from the National Longitudinal Study for Adolescent to Adult Health, also known as AdHealth, which I'll be referring to it because it's such a long title, by ages 24 to 34, 37% of adults are obese, and additionally 30% are overweight. 20% of these young adults have hypertension, another 49% are pre-hypertensive, 6% have diabetes, 27% are pre-diabetic, 17% experience high cholesterol, and 38% have or experience some kind of immune disorder or high inflammation, right? And so not only are most young adults sick, but a lot of times they don't know they're sick. Right? So according to those same calculations, of the young adults who are measured as having hypertension by their blood pressure, only 75% are unaware that they have hypertension, so they haven't gotten a medical diagnosis for this. And the majority, so 90% of those who are measured as having pre-hypertension don't know as well. Same thing with diabetes. So of those who are measured as having diabetes from their A1C, 67% are unaware that they are diabetic, right? And virtually all of those who are measured as being pre-diabetic actually know that they are pre-diabetic, right? There's also really dynamic inequalities in mental health across adolescence, young adulthood, and into the cusp of middle life. So normally when we're thinking about mental health across the life period, across the life course, we're used to seeing something like this, right? This U-shaped pattern, particularly for depressive symptoms, where we expect them to decline throughout young adulthood and middle life, and then to rise again in later portions of our lives, right? But actually some recent work that I've been doing with colleagues at UNC shows that depressive symptoms are actually starting to rise again quite earlier on in life, right? So by early 30s, we're starting to see this uptake in depressive symptoms among young adults, to the point that they either match or exceed the levels that were experienced in childhood and adolescence, when we typically think individuals hit the peak of their poor mental health status, right? And so these rising levels of depressive symptoms, right, or these indicators of despair, as you might have heard from some of the Case and Deaton work, have been linked to mortality burden in the U.S., as well as economic burdens, right? It's costly. Mental and physical health issues are costly to U.S. society. As well as these social and personal burdens, right? So our health and well-being in early life, again, affects our socioeconomic achievement, our personal relationships, our physical health down the road, right? So health during this period is a really serious problem, right? And it can only get worse if it's unaddressed or untreated or unacknowledged. So we really need to understand how we got to this point so early on in life, right? So another way to kind of, in my opinion, to better understand racial health disparities, particularly again in these earlier portions of life, is to reevaluate or reconsider how we capture race in empirical studies. And so from a social constructionist perspective, right, race is this multidimensional concept that's comprised of different indicators, right? So you have racial identity, self-classification, observed race, reflected race, phenotypic characteristics, right, racial ancestry. But the majority of health disparities or health disparity studies really only employ a self-identification variable, right? So inferring race from one's choice of identity at the time, right? So while this has certainly produced very valuable information regarding different inequalities by race, right? These measures are really only capturing one aspect of the stratification process, right? It might overlook some other processes that happen both within one's racial group and also that occur concurrently outside of one's racial group. So other important dimensions of race often go overlooked in studies of health inequalities. Additionally, because the nature and our understandings of racial inequality, it varies depending on which dimension of race that we use. If we focus on one indicator, such as self-identification, can actually lead to findings or assumptions that African Americans are a monolith, right? And that they experience the social world in a homogeneous manner, right? In the same way, which is not the case, which we'll see in a second. So an important but relatively understudied dimension of race that might be extremely helpful is skin color, right? So it's research has long found that the hue of one's skin significantly structures access to opportunities and desired resources among almost all racial ethnic minority groups in the US and even historically among the white racial group. So this unequal distribution of resources based on skin color is generally referred to as colorism, right, which is really a derivative of racism because it's inextricably linked to these hegemonic beliefs in the social superiority of whites and light skin over all other groups. And so it constitutes this ideological and structural system of inequality that affords special advantages to lighter-skinned individuals because of their closer phenotypic resemblance and presumed, at least at one point, presumed genetic similarity to Europeans. And so therefore they fit, or they were closer to these Eurocentric standards of beauty, morality, intelligence, status, etc. So research, right, a long history of research has found that these advantages translate into observed skin color stratification in various outcomes in terms of life chances. So a lot of work has focused on skin color differences in socioeconomic status. But importantly, for at least the purposes of this project, health is also a life chance that has been unequally distributed. So there's accumulating evidence suggesting that darker-skinned African Americans generally experience poorer physical health than their lighter-skinned counterparts. And some of the recent studies that have looked at these relationships are not able to completely account for these skin color inequalities with sociodemographic factors, reports of discrimination, and health-related behaviors. In terms of mental health, similar to the research that's available on race differences in mental health, the literature on skin color disparities is much sparser and provides inconsistent evidence. So there's some work finding that lighter-skinned African Americans tend to have a more positive self-concept of themselves and fewer depressive symptoms compared to their darker-skinned counterparts. But in a relatively recent study by Ellis Monk, he actually documented a higher incident rate of depression among darker-skinned African Americans, followed by light-skinned African Americans, right? And so there was this, the group that had the lowest prevalence rate of depression were those of medium brown skin. Right, and so he actually argued or suggested that the enhanced mental well-being that we see in these race studies are actually driven by that one particular skin color group, right? So dark and light-skinned individuals in his study didn't differ significantly from whites. right? So we know there's heterogeneity going on, but knowledge of skin color disparities in health is still relatively limited, right? Especially in comparison to the wealth of research that we have on self-identified race and health. And so the last thing that is important, again, at least for this project, is that we don't know whether the health consequences of these different dimensions of race might actually vary depending on the surrounding environment in which one is situated. Because really there's been this common assumption that the meanings, the consequences of these different dimensions of race are static across social spaces, right? Meaning that the impacts of race on health are assumed to be the same in every kind of context. But as a sociologist, or really any social scientist will tell you, we're social actors, right? And so we're embedded in these larger social contexts and institutions that can really work to shape our interactions with one another and our understandings of one another. And so this is particularly true of neighborhoods. Right. So there's been, a body of research on focusing on how neighborhood level characteristics, namely socioeconomic resources or social relationships at the neighborhood level, affect individual level health, right? Finding there is a significant association. But while this is important, what we don't know is how the racial context of the neighborhood itself, aside from its correlates with economic disadvantage and what have you, but the actual racial composition of the neighborhood, how that might differentially shape the meanings and the consequences of race and its various dimensions, right? And how those different experiences might shape our health. And so this is what I'm trying to get at in this study. And so to do this, I draw on theories that link these larger social contexts to the potentially differential consequences of race. One being the heterogeneous race model, which was developed by ISR alums, right, here at Michigan, Aaron Celius and Daphne Oysterman, if I say that right, in 2001. But this model really helps us think about why racial contexts in particular are important and how, right? And so this model argues that skin color will have different meanings and significance in settings that are exclusively in-group, so in this case in predominantly black areas, than it will in interracial group settings or predominantly white settings, right? And so the theoretical underpinnings of this model are really in theories of social categorization, self-categorization and social comparison, theories which I'm sure many of you in the room know a lot more about than I do. But putting these theories together, they basically highlight the fact that certain identities become more salient in a particular setting, more salient in terms of boundary maintenance and the types of interactions that are elicited by a given social group. So this would make sense, right? That skin color has different meanings across social spaces, given the history behind colorism and how it's been experienced among the African American population in terms of both privilege and disadvantage. So one example would be in the case of dark brown skin, right, which has traditionally been considered a negative attribute, both by whites and other African Americans. And so we might expect dark-skinned African Americans to receive worse treatment from both whites and other African Americans. And there is some recent research suggesting that this might be the case in terms of reports of discrimination, things like that. At the same time, while those of lighter skin might be treated more favorably in white spaces or by white individuals, they may also experience considerable unfair treatment from other African Americans because they're less readily perceived as members of the black community or the black population and might be treated as such, right? And so there is some interesting, albeit older work that suggests that because lighter skin is seen as more attractive, light-skinned women might be more often pursued by black men, and this might harbor some resentment on behalf of darker-skinned women, resentment for lighter-skinned women, right? We could have a discussion about how that might change in more recent times, but there is research suggesting that this constant feeling of either not being accepted or excluded or resented can take a toll on both your physical and your mental health, right? Those of medium brown skin, however, may be less stigmatized, particularly in majority black contexts or in interactions with African Americans, because they typically represent this this black phenotype, right? Or prototypic black phenotype, right? And so when you think of black individuals, right, you probably go straight to a medium-skinned African-American individual. Additionally, medium brown skin hasn't really been associated with negative characteristics in the same way that light and dark skin has, particularly within the African-American community. And so this might make intra-racial, so right within the racial group, those kinds of interactions easier, right? And so it might afford medium-skinned women, African Americans, a type of protection when they're living and navigating these predominantly black spaces. Okay. So last question becomes, what outcomes might be affected by some of these processes. I'm going to focus on cardiometabolic risk, CMR for shorthand, and psychological distress to see how both physical and mental health is affected. And both of these outcomes are responses to the social world and different stressors that people experience. So just briefly, CMR, it captures these really early indicators of poor health. Again, the poor health that young adults aren't even aware is going on, right? Whereas psychological distress really is this comprehensive measurement of quality of life, right? Bringing together multiple domains of mental well-being. Okay, I know there's a lot. So just to recap, the two main research objectives for this study are to assess the extent to which self and socially identified measures of race differentially influence health disparities between white and African American and adults, and then to see if the health consequences of self-identified race and socially assessed skin color depend on the larger racial context, measured here as neighborhood racial composition. Just a few hypotheses. First, that self-identified African Americans will have worse physiological functioning, yet better psychological functioning than whites. The magnitude of this disadvantage or this difference will vary by skin color, and the extent to which self-identified race and interviewer assessed skin color shape these health gaps between African Americans and whites will differ by neighborhood racial composition, such that growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood will be associated with more positive health consequences for African Americans, particularly those rated as having medium brown skin, while growing up in predominantly white neighborhoods will be associated with more negative health consequences for African Americans, particularly those rated as having darker brown skin shades. Okay. So I use data, again, from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, which is a nationally representative study of U.S. adolescents who were in grades 7 to 12 in 1994 to 1995. There's actually been 4 waves of follow-up since that date. Across the years of 1996 to 2018. So AdHealth actually just wrapped up collecting data for their 5th wave, which was collected between 2016 and 2018. So it should be available if anyone's interested in these data later on this spring or in the summer. But AdHealth is really designed to study the effects of social contexts in adolescence on both the health and behavior in adulthood, right? So the sample for this study is restricted to U.S. born. I want to emphasize U.S. born because it gets a bit more difficult when you're trying to parse out immigrant and generational status kind of dynamics. So for simplicity, focusing on U.S. born women and men who self-identify as white or African American or black, and that have valid biological data, so I can assess cardiometabolic risk. So I have a sample size of about a little more than 10,000. And because I'm interested in studying the effects of early life on adult outcomes, I'm really only using data from waves 1, 3, and 4 of the in-home interviews of AdHealth. So the first outcome, cardiometabolic risk, is a summary measure of health that's taken from wave 4. It basically dichotomizes each of these 7 indicators based on clinical high-risk cut points, and then I sum across the indicators to have a scale of 0 to 7. And in terms of psychological distress, this is measured by 14 items that capture 3 different dimensions of quality of life, so depression, anxiety, and somatization. I can show you exactly what items went into the distress measure if you're interested in the Q&A. But the items were standardized across all of these dimensions and averaged. The predictors of interest are self-identified race, so again, white or black, interviewer-rated skin color, light, medium, dark, or very dark. There was a fifth category of white, but because there were very few African Americans who were rated as having a white skin color, I just combined that with the light category. And then neighborhood racial composition is measured in two ways. First, the proportion of black residents in your census tract dichotomized at race-specific averages, and that's also something we can talk about, but there some ancillary analyses show that there had to be a certain threshold for there to be an effect of black residents. And then the proportion of white neighborhoods in a census tract centered at race-specific averages, so a continuous measure. And then a host of controls at wave one: age, gender, self-rated health, family characteristics, and importantly, neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage and stability. So again, I'm not as interested in how the economics of one's neighborhood might affect your health, right? We know it does, but net of that, is there still this influence of the neighborhood? So Poisson models were used for cardiometabolic risk, ordinarily squares models were used for psychological distress. What I'm going to show you today are the models that look at differences by self-identified race and socially identified skin color, as well as the significant skin color in interactions between skin color and racial composition. Okay. And I use data and weights. Okay, finally, the results. So these are going to be the results for cardiometabolic risk. And so when we're looking at differences by self-identification, whites have a predicted risk of 1.78, whereas blacks have a predicted risk of 2.15, right? No surprise there. Blacks have a higher risk than whites. When we disaggregate these patterns by skin color, what we're seeing is, right, so whites have, again, still 1.78. Light skin African Americans have 2.2 about. Medium skin have about 2 if you round up. And then same for dark, or individuals rated as having dark and very dark brown skin. So blacks have higher cardiometabolic risk regardless of skin shade. And so the magnitude is not significantly different from one another in terms of among the black population. Okay. So these are disparities in cardiometabolic risk by skin color and proportion black, the portion of black residents in your neighborhood. So if you grew up in a neighborhood with a low amount of black residents, this is what the relationship would look like. So whites still have lower cardiometabolic risk, and individuals of all, African-American individuals of all skin colors still have that increased risk in neighborhoods with few black residents. When we're looking at high proportion black neighborhoods, what we're seeing is a significant decrease in cardiometabolic risk only for the medium skin group. Right, and so these other groups are not significantly different from whites in neighborhoods with higher proportions of African American residents. And so what we're finding is that blacks who are rated as having medium brown skin experience a decreased risk, right? So this protection of growing up in predominantly black neighborhoods. So this protection that other groups don't receive. When we're looking at the relationship between skin color and the proportion of white residents in your neighborhood, right? So there's this very shallow slope for whites, but a very steep and growing slope for African Americans rated as having very dark skin, right? So meaning in spaces or in neighborhoods with a lot of white residents, African Americans of very dark brown skin have this increased risk for their physical health. Okay, so we're going to look at the results for psychological distress. Same kind of setup. First, we're just going to look at self-identified race. So again, these are standardized on the scale of standardized, so you'll have negative and positive values. But here, blacks tend to report lower levels of distress than whites. Not too surprising, right? Other studies have found that. But when we disaggregate the Black sample by skin color, what we see is that who's really driving that pattern are individuals rated as having dark and very dark brown skin. So light skin and medium skin African Americans don't significantly differ from whites in terms of their psychological distress. All right. So now we're going to look at the context, right? So proportion Black neighborhoods. So whites who live in low proportion Black neighborhoods have lower levels of psychological distress. Right? There are different values for those rated as having medium and dark skin, but they're not significantly different. But in high proportion Black neighborhoods, there's a bit of an increase, but it doesn't reach the level of statistical significance. But there is a significant decrease in psychological distress for medium and dark skinned African Americans, right? Meaning that these medium and dark skinned individuals who grow up in high proportion Black neighborhoods actually experience psychological benefits, right, compared to their white and light skinned counterparts. And this is going to be one of the last graphs, looking at skin color and growing up in neighborhoods with different proportion of white residents. So for whites, right, the more white residents in the neighborhood, the lower their psychological distress. The exact opposite for those for African Americans rated as having medium skin and dark skin, right? So the more residents that you have in or grow up with in your neighborhood, the higher your psychological distress, right? So again, even though these groups experienced psychological benefits in Black neighborhoods, they're also experiencing psychological risks when growing up in predominantly white neighborhoods. Okay, conclusions. So just to reiterate some of the key contributions of this study, right? Hopefully it has provided some insight into how multiple dimensions of race differentially influence health and health inequality. And it considers the impact of these larger racial contexts, right, by explicitly examining how the racial composition, again, net of neighborhood level socioeconomic disadvantage, might alter the health consequences of self-identified race and socially assessed skin color in adulthood. So compared to whites, African Americans tend to have higher levels of cardiometabolic risk, yet lower levels of psychological distress in adulthood. Again, the magnitude of this difference by skin color depended on the outcome, right? So we saw similar gaps between whites and individuals of skin color groups for cardiometabolic risk, but for psychological distress, the only significant difference that we saw from whites was for African Americans rated as having dark or very dark brown skin. The skin color health relationship also varied by neighborhood racial composition. Just thinking more globally about these findings, majority Black neighborhoods, growing up in majority Black neighborhoods was associated with health benefits in adulthood for medium-skinned African Americans, whereas growing up in majority white neighborhoods was associated with increased risks, increased health risks in adulthood among darker-skinned African Americans. So what's happening here, right? So what might be going on? So a lot of this likely has to do with these inter and intragroup dynamics that might differentially work to shape health, right? So if we go back to the heterogeneous race model, right, we know that social identities can be made more or less salient depending on one's settings or context, right? And so when individuals are surrounded by members of one particular social category, right, so we're thinking about an African American individual living and growing up in a predominantly Black area, they might draw on alternative identities to create these in and out groups to be able to navigate their social spaces, right? So in this case, they might draw on skin color as an identity to create in and out groups, which would really inform how we treat each other, right? So when we're constructing in groups, right, we tend to attribute others like us with these positive characteristics, right, to kind of minimize any differences we see between each others. At the same time, we attribute these negative characteristics to those of the out group, right? We have to distance ourselves from those who are not like us, right? And so if we kind of buy into that kind of process, right? The identities and attributes that are available in a given space, in a given setting, might lead to these different, the construction of these different in-groups and out-groups, and then be linked to differential risks and resources in particular settings. And so this is something I've started to explore empirically by examining some potential mechanisms linking race, place, and health that I'll just go over briefly. So for cardiometabolic risk, a lot of what we're seeing is explained by socioeconomic achievement, health behaviors, feelings of being socially integrated, and perceived attractiveness, particularly for, those rated as having very dark skin, right? Whereas for psychological distress, some of the factors include socioeconomic achievement, perceived stress, perceptions of unfair treatment, and feelings that people dislike you. So kind of taking all these things together, those of medium skin tend to feel more socially integrated, more attractive, right, in predominantly black spaces, whereas those of darker skin tend to have higher levels of perceived stress, unfair treatment, in predominantly white neighborhoods. Okay, so what do these findings mean? One, right, early life context significantly shapes later life outcomes, right, in a variety of ways. So the context in which we grow up really structures how we understand and treat others, and can have a lasting impact throughout our life, right? Relatedly, these findings suggest that African Americans are not a monolith, right? So there is significant heterogeneity within the African American population in terms of experiences with inequalities, and in terms of which dimension of race might be most consequential. And similarly, the consequences of skin color are shown to not be static, right? The values assigned to skin complexion vary depending on the context in which one is situated at a given time. So just a few points in terms of limitations. So one of the biggest theorized mechanisms here is discrimination attributed specifically to skin color, right? Because that will change across contexts. And unfortunately, in the ad health data, we don't have those measures, right? So you're asked, how often do you feel mistreated or treated with less courtesy? And then you can pick an attribution, one of which is skin color, but even just the probing of the question could change how people respond to it. Another limitation, I'm only looking at one context, right, the neighborhood context. And for individuals in this particular life stage, right, something like schools might be more meaningful, right, or friendship networks, right. I'm also looking at the racial composition of these spaces and not the skin color composition, right, and that might also change the dynamics, right, if we know if you are someone of darker skin surrounded by lighter skinned African Americans, right? So what that means for your health. And I also don't really get into the gender dynamics that are going on here. So there's been a host of work, particularly on skin color, the gendered consequences of skin color, where it's really African American women who are most affected by skin color dynamics. And so can imagine that some of these pathways, processes might be different for men and women, but this paper is already too complicated and doing a lot of things at the moment, but that's certainly a next step to see if these vary by gender. And then, of course, considering other minority groups, right? Colorism is a global phenomenon. It's not specific to the U.S. And virtually every racial ethnic minority group, there is some skin color bias. And so what does that mean for their health, as well as other health outcomes, right? So maybe self-rated health is an important next step to see how people actually perceive their own health. Okay, so just to leave you with some final thoughts, right? So the results from this paper indicate that there are multiple dimensions of race that are consequential for health and well-being in early life, right? And these kinds of findings have implications for how we can or how we should measure race and assess racial inequality, right? And so the interactions between racism, colorism, right, that were kind of alluded to here, really produce lived experiences in which race and racial inequality don't mean the same thing for all minorities, right? And so especially if we think about the broader context of how we understand race in the US, right? Where the US for a long time has largely touted itself as a colorblind post-racial society, right? But also espousing these narratives of reverse racism, in which whites feel that they are the primary targets of discrimination, particularly in the workplace. More recently, there's actually been an increase in the amount of Americans who believe that racial inequality is a problem and needs to be fixed. That's also been coupled with these increases, at least in media attention, to these right-wing hate groups, right? And to levels of what's called racial resentment against African Americans by whites. So that's actually seen to be increasing as well. So in the context of additional evidence suggesting that the racial hierarchy in the U.S. is taking more of a pigmentocratic character, these diverging images and understandings in the U.S. really highlight the need to think about which aspects of race are most consequential at this time and in this particular socio-historical context. So is skin color now becoming a more quote-unquote meaningful indicator of inequality, right? That's to be seen, but definitely we need more research that does consider these multiple dimensions of race, both how they work independently of one another as well as in tandem with one another. On a similar note, right, so the interactions between skin color and neighborhood racial composition, again, indicate that social inequality is not experienced equally by members of the African American population, and that social advantages and disadvantages are not homogeneous, right, and they're not static across spaces. So these findings really suggest that embodying multiple identities, whether that be race, skin color, can be accompanied by various degrees of power and oppression, right, depending on the context. And this skin color stratification in health also reflects an excess and unequal distribution of suffering, right, within groups that we already think are unhealthy already, right? So these intragroup inequalities bring attention to experiences of subgroups that often are most disadvantaged and may go overlooked. And then lastly, this is something I really struggle with in terms of thinking about how we might harness or distribute these protections, right, that we see in majority Black spaces, at least for a subset of African Americans, as well as mitigate the increased risks that come with navigating predominantly white spaces. So what can we do with this and really turn around policy-wise and think about the advantages that predominantly Black areas do have, right? A lot of times we think predominantly Black area, lower socioeconomic status. To a large extent, that's true. But what are the resources that we can get out of those areas? Okay, so I'll stop there. Welcome any questions or comments. Yeah.
Super interesting. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about how you got the neighborhood data and whether it captures like changes in neighborhood over time,
Sure.
gentrification, or even the mobility across their early years.
Yeah. So Ad Health has merged on census level data, census tract data, to the respondents that they sampled and collected data on. And so it's their neighborhood that they grew up in. So at one point in time, when they were between the ages of 12 and 20. Part of that was on purpose to keep things simple, and really because of the interest in these longer term effects of your spaces, the spaces that you grow up in. But there's certainly room, and I think it's important to see changes over time. So you move, a lot of times move out of the neighborhood that you grew up in. It may be similar sociodemographically, it may not be, but what does that change look like in terms of your health, right? So I think that's an important question for sure to answer that I just wasn't quite getting at. with this project, especially because not only will you have data for Wave 4 that's available with AdHealth, but some work that a colleague and I are doing is going to merge on even more contextual level data to the Wave 5 interview. So you have this longer period of time to see not only the socio-demographic context that people grow up in, but the health context as well. So we're going to have measures of the amount of people that have diabetes in your neighborhood, the amount of clinics that are in your neighborhood, things like that. So it's an important question.
Then you start your youth at age 12 or so. Do we know anything about age 0 to 12?
Not with these data.
Well, I mean, from other people's research.
In terms of skin color? Or?
In terms of health outcomes and the other variables that you're looking at.
Yeah, so babies born to African American mothers are more likely to be preterm, lower birth weight. These women also experience higher levels of infant mortality. And so we know that those adverse birth outcomes really structure the physiological development of the child as well as the social development of the child. So there certainly are disparities that begin almost at conception, absolutely. But in terms of the environments in which they're growing up in, once they are like 2 or 3 years old, I'm less familiar with. But certainly these understandings are learned early, right? So with any kind of, status, we learn implicitly that light is good, dark is bad, right? So it's definitely, it would be interesting to see, when that started.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm really curious about I might have missed this, but did you include like an individual SCS and neighborhood SCS in the models? Because one thing I was wondering for the skin color and the racial composition correction is pretty interesting. And I'm wondering if part of what is driving that might be interaction between individual SCS and kind of neighborhood SCS. Maybe darker skin actually.
Yeah.
There's more discrimination.
Yeah.
Access to resources, they have lower SCS.
Right.
And then you're living in predominantly white neighborhood, which might be higher SCS.
Absolutely.
Lower SCS living in higher SCS.
Right. So all the models control for the parental socioeconomic characteristics. So the education of the parent, whether the family or any member in the household received welfare, while the child was growing up in the occupation of or the occupational status of the parent. So we can see the socioeconomic context in which they're growing up. In terms of their socioeconomic achievement, that was actually one of the mechanisms that explained the health disadvantages of very dark-skinned African Americans in white neighborhoods. So you're thinking about, we would think more socioeconomic resources, better health. But there's actually a growing body of literature showing these diminishing health returns of socioeconomic resources to health for African Americans. And it's really, at least now, been attributed to the sustained effort that African Americans and other racial minorities have to be able to enter and stay in higher educational contexts, right? So those spaces that they have to navigate usually are pretty straining and can take a toll on their physical health. And so even though they might have more resources, the path that got them there has made them sicker. At least in terms of physical health. So there is that bit of an interplay of, yes, their lighter-skinned African Americans are more likely to have more socioeconomic resources, but particularly for very dark-skinned African Americans who grow up in white contexts, right, who already have a disadvantage against them based on their skin color, it makes that socioeconomic achievement that much harder and stressful, and that's what we see in terms of their health.
So the neighborhood socioeconomic status?
It's taken into account. Yeah. Oh, was that your?
Yeah.
Yes, that's in all the models. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. For those of us who are a little bit older, can trace the history of colorism.
Sure.
And this is somewhat a field of your particular study, but is colorism increasing, decreasing? Does it have a different impact now that we have more individuals who identify as biracial?
Absolutely.
What do you see from patterns of colorism?
Yeah. So the available research shows us it's still there. We're still seeing differences in wages, promotions, right, occupation, wealth even. So that would suggest that there is still these underlying biases. I would probably argue that the overt kind of even advertising, even though it's still there, but the overt advertising of lighter skin being more beautiful, right? That advertising of bleaching creams, things like that, has gone down. Again, that doesn't necessarily get rid of the more implicit biases that are happening. And I think, at least based off of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's, some of his work, that we're turning into a more pigmentocratic society like Brazil and South Africa, where we're relying more on skin color specifically to stratify ourselves. And so that might actually differentiate some of the racial groups that we have now. I think it's only, going to become maybe more consequential, or something that Americans at least will draw on more to know how to interact and treat people. So I think that's a long way to say it's still there. It's still very impactful. And that's in large part, I don't know if I was talking to Robert or James before, but even though we might let go of these more internal schemas about, oh, I'm better because I'm light, or I'm better because I'm biracial, right? I think those have gone down, but the way society treats us still hasn't changed. So it'll be interesting to do almost a period kind of effect, comparing, what's going on now, earlier, and then what happens like 10 years down the line.
I think what's interesting also are the micro-social context.
Absolutely.
Things like churches and civic association, who gets in on the basis of skin color or characteristics like wealth. So those are smaller environments which do a lot of sorting as well.
Absolutely, like the social clubs, like the Jack and Jills, the Links, absolutely. It's still, I know at one point, you had to come from a two-parent household to be able to join some of these clubs. So really kind of narrow thinking about who should be in this prestigious club. Large times based on skin color, right? You think about the brown paper bag test that actually, did exist. And even just the amount of wealth, like you were saying, that you're required to have. It really does sort out a vast majority of individuals. Thanks. Hey.
Okay, really great talk. I'm wondering whether you conducted any sensitivity analysis in terms of potential multicollinearity between racial indicators, SES and neighborhood SES? When you're putting all these in a model.
Right. So when I take neighborhood SES out of the model, the gaps become bigger. And so because, again, the interest was, even accounting for all the economic ills, social ills that might be occurring in these segregated neighborhoods, what is the effect that we're seeing? And so the only other potential form of multicollinearity would be with the parental socioeconomic characteristics. And so even when I take those out, the results are relatively the same. Where I thought you were heading is white individuals who live in predominantly black neighborhoods, which is very rare. There's very few of them, and so I have done sensitivity analyses around that, so excluding those few white individuals who live in highly black neighborhoods. But in terms of the collinearity between neighborhood SES and parental SES, it's just been a matter of taking each of them out. Good question.
To follow up on Dr. Chatter's question, have you also examined or looked at kind of racial composition of the parents? So if you have a black mom, a white mom, black dad, white dad, and how does that affect your colorism, your internal sense?
Right.
Self-identity?
Yeah, I have not. I have not. With So with AdHealth, you do have the race of the parent, even though there is some missingness, especially with the fathers. So that's something to definitely look into. I think what kind of might get at that is the fact that these individuals self-identify as African American. So even if they are biracial, they're still identifying that that kind of identity. But yeah, no, I haven't been able to look at the parent context, particularly if it's an interracial couple, and even the skin color of the parent would be interesting too, which I don't know of any data set that has the skin color of the parent, because we know that, right, socialization happens in the home, right, in the home, schools, neighborhoods, but that's definitely a place where you could learn some of these things and some of these dynamics would play out. There's been some cool research in Brazil, looking at skin color socialization among siblings. And so, as you can imagine, the lighter skinned sibling being treated better by the mother, regardless of the mother's skin color. So given that kind of research, I'm sure there would be some kind of, something going on, for sure.
Did these surveys even give people a chance to identify as biracial? I mean, a long time ago, they often...
Yeah, so this particular one, you can pick more than one race. And so the variable that I use for self-identified race, it really, so there's a question, you can pick multiple races, and then there's a question of, if you did pick multiple races, which is the predominant identity that you have. And so that's what this race variable is based on. But absolutely, there are more people identifying as biracial, multiracial than any other race. So that'll be an interesting group to look out for as well. Those who strictly identify as multiracial rather than black or white or Latino, what have you. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna let that be the last question. Let's thank Dr. Hargrove. And